And welcome everyone. So this is our program for today. Uh, we're the Philosophy of Yoga at Caltech, a club at Caltech, which gives everyone access to the understandings of the philosophy of yoga and not just the postural practice as is commonly known today. And there's much to be learned. And as if you joined our programs for the past three club programs, we invite wonderful speakers who know so much of the philosophy, have lived it in their lives, and they come and share with us what it means. And you can get a lot of benefits and insightful understandings. Like, for example, our program today will be on achieving equanimity through yoga. Staying undisturbed to distresses and calamities. And of course, that I don't think I have much to say on the necessity or the relevance of such a topic in today, where most of us are kind of locked up in our houses, and we're having this on Zoom because it's kind of a disturbing situation. And yoga does help us get through it. And Dr. Resnick is going to talk to us about how exactly it's going to help us. And just a quick note and just a quick introduction to Dr. Howard Resnick. He's born in Los Angeles, and he's a PhD in Indian Studies and Sanskrit from Harvard. And he's known to have translated and summarized many major Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata and the Bhagavata Purana into English. In fact, he's the first Westerner known to have translated the Bhagavata Purana into English. So that makes him a world-renowned authority on the philosophy of yoga. So we're very fortunate to have him here today. And you might also be surprised to know that he speaks 7 languages fluently, like Portuguese, German, Spanish, French, Italian, and Sanskrit. But of course, today's talk is going to be in English. That's his 7th language.
You didn't tell me that.
And more importantly, I feel personally like apart from, he's not just another scholar who knows the philosophy and can speak it, but he walks the talk. He's been a practitioner of it in his own life for like 51 years. And I mean, even if you just live life for 50 years, you go through a lot, and you get a lot of wisdom. But he's practiced yoga for 51 years, and he himself has been through, there are ups and downs for sure, and he can teach us by his own example and practical example from his practical life how to stay zen through calamities and distresses. So with that, I'll let Dr. Resnick, do the speaking, and with that, over to Dr. Resnick.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also like to thank everyone that's participating. Lockdown yoga, I guess this would be called. So as far as the topic, I have some bad news for you, and that is I intend to do some philosophy here, so I hope it won't be too painful. But if we're talking about how we can continue to have a good life, continue to be mentally stable, even happy and productive in the midst of trying circumstances, in the midst of all these difficulties, then we're actually getting into metaphysical territory. And I mean, unfortunately, nowadays, if you study science, or for that matter, if you study the history of Bulgaria or whatever you study, when you study all kinds of topics, people don't study philosophy. And by that, I don't mean you have to know exactly what Hegel or Marx or Plato or Aristotle said. But even you could say the process of philosophizing, just like if you get a doctorate in some field of science, then a lot of what you're learning, apart from your own focus, is the scientific method. And I was just actually watching again just before our program started. There's very interesting, in fact, I can maybe send it to you. There's a little chat here. It's a discussion, a dialogue between a very distinguished rabbi who was a British lord. He's actually Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, and he's talking to a Nobel laureate in science, a gentleman named Aaron Chekanover, Israeli, who won a Nobel laureate for some very, very important discoveries. And so I'm just going to actually, if I can, I'm not very technical, but I think I just sent it to you, or anyway, I may have just sent it to you. So if you don't get it, let me know and I'll send it again. Anyway, so as soon as you say that I want to be happy, or I want to have equanimity, I don't want to be greatly disturbed, emotionally, psychologically, I want to be stable and happy. Even in saying that, you're making some philosophical assumptions. And so let's go into that, because I think that by exploring the inevitable philosophical assumptions that you make, even in affirming a desire to be happy, to be emotionally stable in trying circumstances, simply in affirming that or in desiring that, you are making all kinds of philosophical assumptions. I often say that philosophy is like psychology. You may not study psychology, but you have one. You can't say, well, I don't study psychology, or I don't care about psychology, so I don't have a psychology. It doesn't work that way. It's just like, for example, I may not study anatomy, but I have an anatomy. And so in a similar way, I may not study philosophy, but everyone has a philosophy. Everyone has a philosophy, and it's just like psychology. If you don't know anything about psychology, there's a danger that you're going to develop a weird psychology. If you have no idea, no way to check yourself, no way to monitor yourself according to, let's say, very basic principles of mental health. So if we look at philosophy, I mean, every one of us acts intentionally. We act as we do things on purpose. I mean, there are some people that say that, and I wonder if they even take themselves seriously, that there's no free will, that everything is determined. In other words, in a let's say you're doing physics, and if you know initial conditions, you can predict often what will happen. Like if I drop a ball and you know what the atmospheric conditions are and so on and so forth, you can predict the ball will fall toward the earth and not fall upward toward the moon under normal circumstances. And so the ball doesn't have any choice. Balls don't decide like, hey, I've been falling down my whole life. Like, what would happen if I fell up? I mean, that would be a new experience. Balls don't do that as far as we know. Balls are not conscious and don't have free will, but we do. So when you decide to get out of bed in the morning, that is a value judgment, because you believe that it's in your rational self-interest, it's better for you in terms of whatever you value in life, it's better for you to get out of bed rather than just staying in bed, and so on and so forth. If you brush your teeth, if you go to work or go to school, or of course, that's not happening right now. So let's say you get up and you decide to have breakfast. That's a value judgment. You can say, well, of course I have breakfast because I have things to do, I want to be healthy, but you have to value health. You have to value productivity. Or maybe if you don't eat, your body will, I don't want to say it's not like a sharp pain, but you'll just, it's kind of miserable to be hungry. And so you prefer not to be that way. So every time you do something on purpose, which basically you do at every moment, even mental acts, there are, by the way, this is all philosophy of yoga. I'm just kind of putting it in a Western philosophical context. So we exercise our free will to intentionally perform acts with our bodies, like walking or talking or whatever. And we perform mental acts. You choose to think about something. Let's say you're trying to solve a problem in your field of study, or you're just trying to figure out, like, she loves me not, or he loves me not. In other words, we perform all kinds of mental acts. We do that intentionally. Someone can say, well, don't think about that, but you can say, well, I have to think about it. It's important to me. So either physically or mentally, at every waking moment when we're not asleep, we are doing things intentionally. even if you say, I'm just going to sit here and not do anything, that's also an intentional act, because staying somewhere requires just as much decision as leaving that place. So at every moment we are choosing to do things, and we choose to do things mentally or physically based on what we value. And so therefore, whether we ever took the time to make an inventory of it or not, I mean, you may not, have a catalog somewhere of your values, but we have them. And so because everyone has a set of values, everyone has a philosophy. That's what a philosophy is. It's your values, what you think is important and what you think is not important. That's your philosophy of life. That's your worldview. And so, so what has this got to do with anything? Well, it has a lot to do, because if you take physicalism seriously, now, if you look at the world of science or mathematics, I should make the point that I am very, very strongly pro-science. I'm not pro philosophical materialism masquerading as science, and I'll explain what that means. But in terms of actual science, I am deeply grateful for science. I may be alive today because of science. I mean, I never had specifically a life-threatening disease, but who knows? I mean, maybe I was saved from a life-threatening disease because, of vaccinations, because of this, or because of that, or because of safety systems on airplanes or on cars, or, for all kinds of reasons. People used to die in greater numbers and at younger ages than they do now. So I probably owe my life to science, and I take advantage of science, just like talking to you right now. But now the point is that someone like myself can embrace science and be grateful for it. And I'm kind of in the bleachers cheering, like, yeah, discover more stuff. I mean, positive, good stuff. So I am a fan of real science, but at the same time, I have a strongly, you could say, spiritual worldview in terms of how I understand myself, who I think I am, and what I think the world ultimately is, and what my value system is. So for example, right now, I'm talking to you. I mean, actually, I don't really have evidence that you're out there, but I mean, on my screen, it says you are. So I'm talking to you right now. I'm on my computer, my cute little MacBook Pro on Zoom. And that's all technology. That's all technology, computer technology, communication technology, digital this, digital that. So the point is, I could not communicate with you if I didn't have this technology. If someone stole my computer this morning, or I again spilled water on my computer and ruined another one, I'm really sorry about that. But let's say for whatever reason, I didn't have a computer, or if I didn't have an internet connection, I couldn't be talking to you. So my ability to communicate with you depends on this technology. However, it would be absurd to say that the technology is creating the communication. In other words, to say that actually my computer itself is generating the ideas that I'm speaking. It's certainly communicating them, but the ideas are mine. I'm, kind of thinking of this stuff to say or whatever. So this is my message, even though it's going through a computer, and I'm a person, I'm a conscious person. So in the same way, just as it would be absurd to say that actually my computer is making me say certain things or telling me to say certain things, and then I'm speaking them, but actually it's the computer who is the brain inside, who's really like creating these ideas. That would be absurd. It is equally absurd to say that the brain creates consciousness. That's my point. It's equally absurd to say that your neurological system, all the brain stuff with its extensions and other parts of the body, it would be equally absurd to say that the neurology is creating the consciousness. The consciousness in this material world. Right now, we are in the material world. And so just as I could not communicate with you without this technology, so you could not communicate with the world. You could not, let's say, perceive the world through your different senses and so on without this neurological technology. But just as my computer is conducting, it's transmitting ideas that are coming from a living conscious person. So your neurological system is transmitting, it is conducting or facilitating, enabling you as a conscious being to function in this world. And without the material body, you wouldn't be doing a lot of stuff here in this world right now. You probably wouldn't participating in this little thing we're doing if you didn't have a material body. I mean, we won't go into ghosts and all that. So the reason this is important is because the point I want to make to you is whatever someone told you in a class somewhere, none of us are really, at least people here, and hardly anyone on earth is really a physicalist in the philosophical sense. In other words, someone that believes that nothing really exists except physical things, which is a philosophy, by the way. That's not science. That's a philosophy of science, or it's a philosophy of life. And I think it's very easy to demonstrate how that's true. I'm not just going to declare it. I'm going to say more about how that's true. For example, I can't, most of you don't have your video on, unfortunately. It'd be nice to see you, but that's okay. Otherwise, I could ask you to raise hands, like how many people who are listening to this class right now think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with enslaving other people? And in terms of what your criteria is, like who do I enslave? It could be, well, I believe that everyone of a certain race or a certain ethnicity or of a certain religion should be enslaved, or maybe gender, maybe men should enslave women, or in other words, well, raise your hand, like unmute yourself and tell us if you think that's okay. It's like, I don't see, and you're speaking seriously. I mean, you're not just, being the foil here, but if you really honestly, in the core of your heart, believe there's absolutely nothing wrong with, let's say, enslaving other people on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, or just whoever you happen to come across. So here's your chance to out yourself. No?
I think in a cosmic sense, it's kind of arbitrary.
Oh, good. Someone good. So who is that? Who did that? I mean, thank you for saying that, because now we have a discussion. So who is that? I'm trying to see who it was.
Yeah,
so,
my name's Max.
Max. Well, thank you, Max. That was good. Thank you. Thank you for, okay. So I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm going to do something really, really nasty and actually look closely at the word you chose. So if we say in a cosmic sense, what's that? Go ahead. Max, did you want to?
No, I think that's someone else. That's not me.
Oh, okay. Okay, so first of all, like, it's probably not literally the cosmic sense, because cosmic just means the universe. So, but anyway, if you say, so what does that mean in a meaningless, in a cosmic sense? That would mean that to be consistent, you would actually have to say that there's nothing wrong with it. So, I mean, is that what you actually feel inside? That if you're walking down the street and let's say there's you see someone right in front of your eyes blow up a school bus full of children, that actually there's nothing wrong with that, that the person that did that really did nothing wrong? I mean, is that what you really feel?
I think when I say cosmic sense, it's kind of like, what scale do you think about what matters? And if I think about the scale at which I'm trying to realize my own values and what I think is right in the world, then it's not right. But if I think about something outside of myself, and and what values are correct, objectively correct, then it doesn't have to matter?
It doesn't. Well, let's think about that for a second.
If I may interrupt, we have another raised hand by Natalie
Oh,
Black.
yeah, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, no, I just wanted my video to be, my video is disabled. I was trying to get the host to.
Oh. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. But you see, what I would argue is that raising this to a cosmic context makes no difference. It's like, for example, let's say it were a fact. Let's say you became aware on some exoplanet somewhere that there was conscious life. There were real people. They had feelings. They had emotions. They loved their children. They cared about other people. And on that planet, someone killed an innocent person. Are you saying that there's actually nothing wrong with that? That right now, let's say if you or I go out and start massacring innocent people, that ultimately we're not doing anything wrong. Apart from, let's say, trying to be consistent with what you've been told about the nature of reality by materialistic philosophers, do you think that that's, well, let me actually tell you what I think, and then you can respond to it, because this is an interesting discussion. There's an epistemological principle, epistemology being the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge, like under what circumstances, in a sense, that's what Max and I are doing. Under what circumstances are we justified, warranted, they often say, are we justified in saying that I know something and it's not just my opinion, or it's not just something I feel? So I will claim here in my discussion with Max that actually it is wrong. It is wrong to significantly harm innocent people. And it's not just our opinion, or it's not just a feeling, it's actually wrong. And so obviously someone could say, or Max could say, well, how do you know that's true? How can you prove that that's actually true? And so in response, I will give an analogy from empirical science. It is a logical possibility. It's a logical possibility, which means it doesn't contradict just the meanings of words. For example, an example of a logical impossibility would be a square circle. I don't even think Einstein's space-time can do that. So if you know what the word square means and what the word circle means, you know you can't have a square circle. You don't. If I say, for example, I'm in Coronado right now, an island just off the coast of San Diego. And so if I say, I just saw a unicorn here on the island, and you could say, I don't believe that. So you could actually bring a search party or whatever, and you could actually look for the unicorn. So that's an empirical claim. I saw a unicorn. But if I say I saw a square circle on the island, you don't have to go look for it, because that's a logical impossibility. It's a logical impossibility. If you know what the word square means and what the word circle means, there's no such thing. The words, if you juxtapose those two English words, square, circle, you didn't say anything. It's a meaningless statement and doesn't really describe anything which is logically possible. So in that sense, it's logically possible. It's not logically impossible that, let's say, Max, you are, to use Descartes' example, the philosopher Descartes, you are a brain in the laboratory of some evil genius who is just manipulating your brain in various ways so that you believe, let's say that you're a student at a certain university, you believe there's a world, there's an earth, you believe there's a universe, you believe there's such a thing as, the cosmos. But actually you're just a brain in a laboratory. Now you actually can't prove that that's not true. Because if you hold something up, like for example, here's my little 2.5-year-old iPhone. There it is. So I could say, well, that's a real iPhone. And so that proves there's a real world, but that's logically absurd because it's called circular reasoning. Circular reasoning means you're trying to prove something. So the very point you're trying to prove, you use it as evidence for itself. So your argument is going around in a circle. Because this is a real iPhone only if there's a real physical world. And I'm trying to prove there's a real physical world. So I can't give a physical object as proof that there's a real physical world. It's logically absurd. Nowadays, philosophers, instead of using Descartes' brain in a laboratory, they say a brain in a vat. I don't know why they changed. Maybe they just don't like Descartes for some reason. But anyway, but the point here is that how can you do science, or why do you do science, if you can't prove there's a real physical world outside your mind? You can't prove that. Aristotle addressed this problem, interestingly, over 2,000 years ago. And Aristotle said that whatever you claim to be true, you can be pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. So for example, if I claim that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, which is right there, it's about 17% of all my science knowledge. So water, let's say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So someone could say, prove it. So I take a pot of water, I put it on the stove, put a thermometer in and say, look, it boiled at 100 degrees. And someone could say, well, that's not pure water. You added something to the water. So we have to test the water. Or someone could claim, I don't believe that's really mercury in the thermometer. So you have to test their mercury. But then you have to test the water testing chemicals. And so you're pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. So as Aristotle pointed out, and it's still, I mean, philosophers still, most of them, the ones that have common sense, understand this, that in order to build any system of knowledge, whether it's a religious system of knowledge, or it's an empirical system of knowledge, or a mathematical system of knowledge, you have to begin by declaring earnestly that there is a self-evident fact which proves itself. For example, let's say you go outside and the sun is shining. Well, that's not actually where most of us are on the West Coast here. But let's say you go out in the morning, the sun is shining and everyone sees it. And everyone, everyone's saying as they walk by each other, beautiful day, sunny day. And then someone comes along and says, no, there's no sun in the sky. There is no sun. Are you going to try to, and so there's three possibilities there. There are three logical possibilities. If someone says there's no sun in the sky, one is the person is lying. Either it's a joke or, for some reason, whatever it is, the person is just lying, maybe trying to confuse you. A second possibility is the person is crazy or, mentally impaired. And the third possibility is the person is visually impaired. But who is going to try to prove to that person the sun's in the sky? Because everyone knows it's true. Here's another example. Just like you do science, because the world presents itself to your consciousness in a way that you are convinced self-evidently that there's a real world out there. Let's say you're dreaming and you wake up. And when you wake up, you decide very quickly that the world you're experiencing awake is more real somehow, ontologically superior, is somehow more real to the world of your dream. Now, you can't prove that. You can't prove that it is because you have no further access to your dream. There's no way in the world you could construct an experiment to prove that your dream was not the real world. So my point is, in our real life, we build our systems of knowledge on assumptions that something is self-evident. And so what I'd like to say to Max after this long explanation is that actually we know that it's wrong to go out and cause significant harm to innocent people. And I have enough faith in Max and his moral instincts that if he actually witnessed something like that, he would react the way we do, with utter horror and repugnance. If you saw some horrible deed right in front of your eyes, and you'd probably try to stop it if you could. So my point here is that, for example, if I say that, so my point is it's self-evident. And this was the argument of Kant, the philosopher Kant, who in his attempt to save metaphysics kind of ruined it. But anyway, that's another thing in the Western philosophical tradition. But the German philosopher Kant argued that our moral instincts are its knowledge at the deepest level, that we know that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. Like it's right to help an innocent person in need. Let's say you see a child who's about to drown and you have the power to save that child. You see an innocent child drowning and you have the power to save that child, and you do save the child. It's not that, we can tell ourselves a story just so that, materialistic people don't laugh at us. We can tell ourselves a story that, well, I know that I really had no moral obligation to save the child. I had no moral obligation to save my own child or my parents. If they were drowning and I had the power to save them, loving parents, I really don't have an obligation because obligations are metaphysical. And there's really,
Can I push back on one point?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're saying that this is kind of an axiom, and it still feels subjective to me because for me personally, I would say that having pets is a form of oppression on animals, and that to me is an axiom, but it doesn't appear that doesn't appear to be an axiom to everyone else. And so now it just seems subjective. And similarly, the point that we were originally discussing about enslaving people also seems subjective given that kind of inconsistency I see in my own life.
Well, I would say regarding pets that the pet example is not really an argument against what I'm saying for the following reason. I think the pet owners, the ones that are not cruel and disgusting, let's say pet owners that really, they love their pets or they're trying their best, they believe, and there actually is a lot of evidence to back this up, that their pets will have a better life as pets than they would in the wild. For example, I remember when I was younger, I spent a few years living on a very beautiful farm. Actually, it was sort of a country ashram and farm in Brazil, between Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And it was, I was fortunate to live there when there was no electricity, and it was a great experience. And what I learned there is that, take, for example, cows, an animal which is almost exclusively found in a domesticated situation nowadays, that being domesticated by, let's say, owners that are not cruel, they're not going to kill them, is the best thing that can happen to a cow or a bull. Because in the wild, what I found is, for example, the area I lived, there were some hills. And sometimes cows, a cow or a bull, they stumble or they trip, and they can break an ankle or injure themselves. They do that, they die. They just lie there, they can't get up, and, horrible predators come and just literally slowly and in a very awful way, tear them gradually limb from limb. So, and in other ways, for example, the cattle, you could say, they get all kinds of, they get ticks and bugs. I mean, there's a certain kind of really nasty bug in Brazil. It looks like Shangri-La, but they're bugs. And there's one kind of bug, which I got myself. It's called, if anyone knows Portuguese, berne. It's this little bug that kind of like gets under your skin. You don't know what's happening. And then it just kind of, it's just like crazy. Like enough to drive you crazy. And the animals get this. And if the animal has a good owner, a word, maybe we should find a nicer word for it. But if there's a nice person taking care of the animals, they take these bugs out. They heal them from diseases. Animals in the wild can have horrible, miserable, tortured lives. And so, but still the point I wanted to make here is that you and, let's say, a pet owner probably agree that there is some kind of moral obligation to the animal, and that is not to intentionally cause significant harm to the animal, and if it's within your power to do what is in the interest of the animal. And so if that's the case, even though you may have different strategies to act morally in relation to a non-human person, you're not disagreeing on the moral obligation. And therefore, that in no way weakens my argument that at the deepest level, because you see, I can say to scientists that you can't prove there's a real, you can't prove there's a real world out there.
So can I make a point?
Yeah, sure, please.
So I think we all in this meeting would agree that that it is wrong to kill people. However, it is that is because we have a certain set of beliefs. But it is possible to think of the possibility that somebody wouldn't share that belief. For example, if a parent really, excuse me, believes that their son will go to hell if they are gay, they truly believe that, then they are then justified to, you know, to try to fix it or something. Also, using the arguments that you were using for pets, and that pets are, you know, worse off in the wild, wouldn't then one be able to say that the planet is better off without humans?
Well, that's a tough one to refute. But anyway, but as far as, let me go to the first point. I think you see, there's an unstated, but nonetheless crucial premise in your argument. Without that premise, your argument doesn't work. So I'm going to bring that unstated premise to the surface and we can look at it. And the premise is that if someone acts consistently with their beliefs, then we cannot say they acted immorally. Now, if that were the case, I think that leads to very quickly to absurdities. For example, Adolf Hitler really believed that he was making the world a better place by genocide. And so you see, here we have the problem that an argument can be consistent but absurd. For example, here's an argument. I'll give you an argument that is logically consistent. There's no logical problem with this argument. All birds are horses. No, actually, let me do it the other way. All horses are birds. All birds have 20 legs. Therefore, all horses have 20 legs.
Sorry, go on. Sorry.
There's no logical problem with that argument. It's just absurd and obviously not true, but it's not logically, there's not a logical problem. Or you can have an argument where everything you say is true, but it's logically absurd. So what I'm trying to say is that logical and true are completely different criteria. For example, I could say that horses are quadrupeds. Mexico City is the capital of Mexico, and therefore it rained today. I mean, all those statements could be true. That horses are quadrupeds, Mexico City is the capital of Mexico, and it did rain today, but there's absolutely no logic. I mean, logically, it's absurd, but all the statements are true. And you can have an argument where you have complete logical consistency, but the premises are absurd. And so do you really want to go down the road of moral relativism? That if anyone is acting in accord with their own beliefs, like someone may think, for example, that all non-white people should be enslaved. And so that person, let's say, kidnaps non-white people and enslaves them. And all you can say is, well, it's not immoral because that person is acting with integrity consistently according to their beliefs.
I think you made a good point with the logical argument, and I think that this is perhaps what's missing here. That there's an underlying assumption. I think that maybe perhaps you're pointing towards.
Enrique, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was hoping if we could have discussions towards the end, because we could get the topics. We do. I assure you that we will have at least 30 minutes of discussion towards the end. And I'm sorry, I should have said that at the start. So
okay. So who was that was just talking that we just cut off? Who was that?
Enrique.
Oh, Enrique. Yeah. So please keep your thoughts in mind, because I want to be able to, I want you to have a chance to.
I apologize for that. we will be open up in the end for discussions. We will have.
No, but I really appreciate the questions. It's it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's kind of my fault. I should have announced that at the beginning.
Okay. So to get to the topic, because I don't want people to sue me because I never spoke on the topic. So, I mean, in terms of yoga, in terms of, please don't sue me. In terms of yoga philosophy, what yoga philosophy teaches us is that we are actually spiritual beings. And because if you say equanimity, I mean, obviously in the simplest terms, if the external circumstances, or even, let's say, are very disruptive or erratic or dangerous, disturbing, and so on, and if we make the point that we should still be peaceful and happy, where does that constant come from? What is the basis of the equanimity? What's it based on? And you could say, well, I can just tell myself that since I can't control the circumstances, I'm just, for my own rational self-interest, I'm just going to sort of force myself to be in a peaceful state of mind just because I find that a peaceful state is more enjoyable than a disturbed state. So even though I'm really in danger and I really could be annihilated at any moment, since I'm a materialist and my body goes, that's it, I cease to exist forever. But I think I'll just, but you see, on those grounds, it might be in your interest just to really embrace the brave new world, find some good drug, knock yourself out, or just keep yourself in la-la land. And so why not? I mean, that was the whole point of Huxley, his book, Brave New World. I mean, why not just give yourself some sort of like, you know, some la-la drug and just cruise? Why deal with the world? So I'm going to argue, well, I'm going to say, and then, you know, I won't give an argument for it, but I think it's pretty self-evident that the real way to stay happy and peaceful in a very disturbing, unpredictable world is not just to find some drug that makes you kind of stupidly happy. And there is something stupidly happy, I would say, about just trying to embrace peace for its own sake in the midst of danger. In other words, sort of like blind stoicism, because I think it's an obvious logical principle that you cannot, that if you place a positive value on something, there must be a commensurate negative value attached to its loss. For example, let's say you have $10 and you lose them. Then you lost $10. Now you may say, well, I've got much more money than that, I don't care about it, but that means you placed a low value on the $10, either because you have a lot of other money, or because you know there's a lot more where that came from, or maybe you're suicidal and since I'm not gonna be here tomorrow, so I don't care if I lost it. But for whatever reason, if you lose $10 and it doesn't bother you, it's because you did not place a significant value on it. And so the greater the value you place on anything, your money, a relationship with someone, your health, your life, the more positive value you place on something, logically, there must be exactly that much negative value upon losing it. And so if you're like me, and I greatly value life, I mean, I actually am in love with being alive. I love my life despite all my imperfections. And I could not be more grateful that I have a life. And so therefore, where's the equanimity coming from? And I would say in yoga, it's coming from the fact, your awareness that actually you never die. And you never really become sick because you're not the body. And that's where the stoicism of yoga comes from. It comes from that understanding of who you really are. Krishna gives a proof of this. I mean, this is a very smart crowd, Caltech, 7.7 admission rate. So I'm going to give an example from the Gita. Krishna gives an argument in the Bhagavad Gita. And the Sanskrit is, in case you're interested to know how Sanskrit sounds, Dehi nosmin jatha dehi komarang jovanamajara. Tatade hantara praptir. So dhiras tatranamuyati. What Krishna says is that all of us have experienced komaram, which means childhood, yovanam, youth, cognate word from Sanskrit to English, jovan, youth, and jara, old age, from where we get the word geriatrics, from Sanskrit jara. It's interesting, two of these words actually we have still in English, cognate words. Anyway, so the point is, you were a child, you were an adolescent. Unless you're a prodigy, you're probably, if you're a Caltech, you're probably not an adolescent still. But anyway, young adult. And so we know that we're the same person. Descartes gave this argument where he said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. You can doubt everything, but you can't doubt that you're thinking. You can't doubt that you are conscious, because in the act of doubting, you are proving that you're a conscious being, an individual conscious being. So you say, because we do a little linguistic analysis here, everyone says, yeah, when I was 3 years old, my mom took me to the circus or something, or when I was 7 years old, this happened, or when I was 11, or when I was 7. So we say I, because you know that it was you practically more than you know anything else. You know that you were a child, you grew up, but it's a different body. It's not the same body. So if you say, I am the body, which body? Because you've had millions of bodies. We often say every 7 years, you replace all the elements, but the famous pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus said, you can't step in the same river twice. He said this about 2,500 years ago, at the same time Buddha was teaching. So there was this thing going around the world, like everything in this world is temporary, everything is changing. It was kind of this idea going around the planet. And so you find it in ancient Greece, you find it in India with Buddha. So anyway, the idea that you can't step in the same river twice. But I could use the same logic to say you can't breathe in the same body twice. The next time you take a breath, you know that there's like millions of things going on in your body, millions of things going on at every moment. And so the second breath, it's not exactly the same body. This is the whole point of Buddhism. That's what the Buddhists mean by shunyata, emptiness, that the universe is empty of any visible object that is just itself, rather than being constantly in flux and changing its identity at every moment. So there's no stable thing. That's what the Buddhist emptiness is. So therefore, how could you be your body? How could you say, I am my body, when you've got a different body every moment? And yet you are the same person. No matter how many times you change your mind or whatever, there is a deep, inescapable sense in which it is still you. It's always been you. You are a continuous conscious being. And so I should say this is not rocket science, by a little thought, you can understand that conscious being is not the body. It's you. It's the person. It's the person who's inside the body. Even materialistic philosophers, I'm thinking of John Searle at Berkeley and others, even materialistic philosophers admit that consciousness is a special kind of thing. It's not a material thing. It's just like, the fact that you're conscious. You can study, for example, optics. You can study all the science of optics, and you can say under certain conditions that an object appears to a normal human observer as red. But if you study all the neurology of it, there's no redness. There's no experience of red. It's just a bunch of molecules and atoms and subatomic particles. There's no experience of red. That's called in philosophy qualia. Qualia means the qualities that are only real for consciousness. Because you could talk all day and night about the science of what makes something look red or blue, but that science is not going to give the experience of actually seeing a red object. In fact, that's why philosophers for hundreds of years have realized that direct realism is not serious philosophy. Direct realism in philosophy means that let's say you see a red ball. Let's make it a red wagon, actually. We already talked about balls. Give wagons a chance. Let's say you see a red wagon. The redness is not in the wagon. The physical structure that conveys redness, that makes you see it as red. Yeah, that the object exists in such a way that it interacts with your optical system and it creates in your consciousness the color red. But the redness that only exists in consciousness is not there in the chemicals of the wagon. The chemicals aren't red, they're just chemicals. And so we can understand that we are not the body, we are actually some kind of conscious being inside the body, and the body's changing, but we remain the same person. We can understand that consciousness is a different kind of reality. It's not like just a physical thing. It's not physical, it's consciousness, it's different. And so if you understand yourself to be a conscious being, not identical with the body, then you can be detached and you can remain peaceful and calm, even though external circumstances may not be favorable, because ultimately, I mean, all of us want a happy life. I don't want to be put in some horrible situation where all I've got is my philosophy. I mean, I would much rather have a peaceful, happy life. But still, in the circumstances we're in, if you know that actually you are a different kind of object that cannot be materially destroyed for the simple reason it's not material. It's not a consciousness. Life is not a material thing. It's very well known in biology that biologists cannot escape teleological language. Teleology is a branch of philosophy that there are objective purposes, not just a subjective purpose. You can say, okay, tomorrow I want to, I don't know, read a book. So you give yourself a purpose. It's subjective because you could decide, I'm not going to read the book. So it's just a subjective purpose. But are there purposes that exist for you, whether you see them or not? In other words, were you born for some purpose? And even if you don't recognize it, it's still the purpose of your life. You just don't know it. And of course, in order for there to be objective purposes in reality, reality must ultimately be somehow personal. It gets into the notion of a God, which is a no-no word nowadays because, anyway, that can be explained according to historical dialecticism. That's one of Newton's laws of motion, the pendulum effect, equal and opposite reactions. And so you get a lot of fanatical religion, and people think to be intellectual, you can't be religious, which is incredibly naive philosophically, but that's another topic. So anyway, so that's what yoga does. Yoga teaches us who we really are, and therefore we're all kind of like Superman or Superwoman. I mean, ultimately, the sense that who we really are is invulnerable. You actually can never die. You actually couldn't kill yourself if you tried. I mean, we can destroy the body, but we actually cannot destroy ourselves. We don't have that power, and no one else can. And that's called self-realization. That was the goal of yoga, to have this self-realization. That was like the main point in yoga, to have this realization that I'm invulnerable as a consciousness can't be materially destroyed because it's not material. So anyway, I don't know if you have any questions or 5 minutes left. Then there's the, it's interesting. I'll maybe just say one. Did you want to say something that?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
If this consciousness, if we believe that evolution created at some point conscious beings, what's the preview, like, does this reality emerge when consciousness is finally
No. I would say it differently. I mean, just like, for example, science evolved to the point of creating computers, or technology, applied science evolved to the point of creating computers, but the computers didn't create the consciousness of the person that uses the computer. And so you can say that as long as we're in the material world, and by the way, I don't know if you follow intellectual history, contemporary intellectual history, but there's a huge movement going on among scientists, neurologists, biologists, philosophers of mind against philosophical materialism. And so simply to blindly kind of, and there's a huge movement against Darwin by people that aren't religious. I'm not talking about, some kind of, young earth creationists or something. I actually have to say one thing. I once heard on NPR on the radio an interview with the scientist no, he was the president of Caltech. And that was about, oh my God, it must have been 15 years ago or something. And he said something which was so ridiculous, I couldn't believe it. I mean, no offense to your school. And that is, he was taking all the people who believe in some form, who just don't believe that the most sophisticated material technology ever imagined, which is your body, just assembled itself. It's like saying a supercomputer assembled itself. And if you don't believe that, it's become a dogma. It's become a dogma. And he was saying that, he was kind of conflating all the different philosophers who believe that random mutation and blind selection explains everything. It's like saying random mutation and blind selection could explain computers, which is absurd. So anyway, if you follow what's going on, like cutting edge intellectual history, contemporary intellectual history, there's a huge academic revolt against simplistic Darwinism. And a lot of the people, revolting, there's hundreds and hundreds of scientists, scholars, philosophers, a lot of them are not religious. A lot of them are not religious. They're just saying this doesn't make sense. So consciousness is not, I mean, in a sense, was that Enrique again? Was that...
No, sorry, this is Manuel.
Oh, Manuel, sorry. There's another philosophy which may be what you were getting at, and I apologize if it's not, and that's called Epiphenomenalism. And that's saying that consciousness is different than just dull matter. There is something distinct and unique about consciousness as an energy, but it comes from matter. It evolves out of matter. And what more and more philosophers and even biologists and neurologists are saying is, that's ridiculous. What does that even mean? And how would you prove it? You see, the problem is that if you just do science, we're all cheering you on. We're all on your side. I love science. I'm, all in favor of science. But when you say that consciousness comes from matter, which if you think about it, it's kind of absurd if you think about what consciousness really is, how will you prove that? That's philosophy. That's not science. And generally, the so-called proof that's given, which is ludicrous, is that when you manipulate the brain in different ways, you change the manifestation of consciousness. Well, of course you do. Because you see, that would happen if you believe that consciousness does not come from matter. It's a completely different kind of energy. And still, in this material world, it's dependent on material technology, your nervous system. It depends on it, and that the nervous system is conducting consciousness, you'd get exactly the same result. When you manipulate the brain, you would affect consciousness. So you get the same result if you say that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, it evolves out of matter, or if you say no, it pre-exists matter. In either case, you get the same neurology. I mean, Newton in his Scholastium, when they printed another edition of his Principia, Newton, and he wrote an introduction saying that, okay, I've shown how gravity works. Why in the world does it work that way? Why should an object exert gravity on another object? And he said, Newton's best guess was because God made it that way. So what's interesting is if you look at the great astronomers, Copernicus, Kepler, if you look at Newton, if you look at all these people, they felt that the more science advances, the more you show we live in a lawful universe. We live in a universe governed by laws. It's a rational universe. And the more you show, and that's what science assumes. You can't do astronomy unless you assume that the same laws of nature operate light years away from us. If the laws of nature at other points in the universe are completely different, then a huge amount of science is just all wrong. So you assume uniformitarianism, you assume the laws of nature are uniform, you assume all kinds of things. You assume there's not some evil genius who's kind of, you know, messing things up, skewing with the data, giving you wrong impressions. It's like during war, you know, because everyone is spying during war. So what a country does is it leaks information to its enemy, but it leaks false information. And so how can you prove that the universe or God or any word that somehow you don't think is not, you know, respectable for an intellectual, how can you prove that some power in the universe is not leaking wrong information? You can't prove that's not the case, but you believe it's not the case. You need just as much faith to be a materialist as to be a spiritualist. This dichotomy that materialists are just, you know, rational, they want evidence, and spiritualists just have faith, it's philosophically ridiculous.
I have a quick question on that point.
Yeah, please.
So it seems to me like these two notions are equally disputable or equally not provable. But then the scientific method is kind of built on this idea of Occam's razor. When you have two equally describing sets of assumptions, you take the smallest set of assumptions to work with.
If the assumptions are not absurd. It's, in other words, I believe in Occam's razor, but actually look at it this way. If we want to take, for those of you who don't know, Occam's razor is basically the simplest explanation is the best. You know, just if you can explain things simply and someone else, in other words, if someone says, I want half the pie, and someone says, I want 124, 248 of the pie, it's like, just say you want half the pie. So in other words, the simplest explanation is the best. But you see, I would say materialism doesn't explain anything. It's not actually an explanation. Because
so in the sense that you were just pointing out that you could not prove whether a consciousness behind a material body was itself affected by these brain experiments, or if it was just the interface that was affected.
Oh, you can prove it. No, actually you can easily prove it. That's yoga. That's called self-realization. I'll explain it. Let's say, hypothetically, that we are souls. We are conscious souls, and we're not our bodies. We are inhabiting these bodies, but we are not the bodies. Now, if that's the case, that explains everything right there. And not only does it explain everything much more simply than 20 volumes on the latest brain science. I mean, if you want to talk about simplicity, I say, I am a soul. You say, here's a whole encyclopedia of brain science, and you're claiming simplicity. I don't think so. Another point is that if it's the case that I am a soul, and if it's the case that there's some kind of supreme infinite consciousness who is not malicious, as Einstein said, not just playing with the universe, then I can be capable of self-realization. I can have direct, powerful, irrefutable experience of my nature as a spiritual being. You see, what you're doing there in the argument, the way you constructed it is, it's kind of like, what's the word? It's kind of like it's not a fair challenge. Let's put it that way, because you're saying that, okay, the question is, am I pure consciousness, a pure, eternal, spiritual consciousness inhabiting a body, or is my sense of being a person just something that evolved out of dead matter? And so the claim that if I am just spiritual consciousness, I can't prove it, is circular reasoning. What I can't, maybe I can't prove it empirically, but but empiricism is not a neutral arena. In other words, it's like saying that, let's say someone claims that, the ocean is so many feet deep, and someone says, prove it. You say, okay, here's a thermometer. And the thermometer, that's not how you measure ocean depth. You don't do it with a thermometer. So why would I prove empirically something that's not empirical? You are claiming it's a type of epistemological imperialism. It's saying that, okay, we are king of the hill, we rule the world of knowledge, and so we're like the gatekeepers of objectivity. No one reaches. It's like the worst kind of fanatical religion. No one comes to the Father except by me. And you're saying no one comes to objectivity by me. It's the equal and opposite fanaticism. And dialectically, that's actually what's going on, is that you have this fanatical religion, which according to Newton's laws of motion, created its equal and opposite fanaticism. No one comes to objectivity except through us. How will you prove that? Because that statement itself can't be empirically proved. When you say that things have to be empirically proved, you immediately contradict yourself. You immediately contradict yourself because the claim that things have to be empirically proved can't be empirically proved. You can't empirically show there's nothing beyond empiricism.
Thank you. I think that explained my point. Just a final comment on that. I think the notion is, the way I always understood Occam's razor and all that, is not necessarily that is the only path to truth. It is just the most practical of the approaches to life. And so in a similar sense here, is it more about what is actually true? Or is it more about the actual question of which mindset or which understanding and notion of reality is the most practical for us to work with?
I would say, I'm going to date myself now. I did not grow up in the post-truth stage. And I think this, which, now we have a post-truth president, of course. So my point would be that, yeah, I care about the truth. I mean, I want to know who I really am. That matters to me. I don't want to live in sort of a happy delusion. I don't want to think I'm a soul just because it makes me feel good. And so that's like the Brave New World. I might as well take drugs. If all I care about is just making myself feel good, I can just take drugs and I don't have to follow the principles of a yoga practice. So yeah, I believe in objectivity. I think, in fact, you get that there's this, should I name him? I don't want to, anyway, there's this famous philosopher from the 20th century, Richard Rorty. He was, considered one of the prominent, and he would contradict himself so much, it would make your head spin. Like, he was this postmodernism, saying like, there are no great truths. Really? Well, you just claim to have a great truth. If you say there's no ultimate objective truth, but you just claimed one.
Can I actually respond to the person that made the question?
Yeah, please.
So I think another way of seeing Occam's razor, is like the simplest explanation is the best, and a measure of simplicity is the number of assumptions that it makes.
Yeah.
So as you made the point earlier that that one thing that we cannot deny, perhaps is the only one, is that we experience. So that is one thing that we don't need to assume anything for. And so then in that sense, the materialist perspective it makes a lot of assumptions, because it makes more assumptions than simply accepting that the experience of the present is what is the only thing that's fundamental. And so I think in terms of Occam's razor, it would make more assumptions to assume that there's a material world.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very well said. And that's really what I was trying to say, that in order for me to be a materialist, first of all, I have to deny everything I experience. I have to deny all my moral intuition. I have to deny my aesthetic intuition. For example, I believe some things are really beautiful in the world. I think nature at its best can be exquisite and beautiful. But on the materialist assumption, there is no beauty. I have to explain away aesthetics. I have to explain away ethics. I have to explain away our deepest intuitions, which are ethical. as Kant pointed out. I mean, they go to the core of our being, our ethical obligations toward our children, toward our family, toward other people, toward animals. So I have to explain away with all kinds of sophisticated philosophy and neurology, aesthetics, ethics, all kinds of metaphysics. I mean, I have to explain away democracy. I have to explain away equality. I have to explain away everything, because our world. I mean, look at our political system, democracy. Democracy is based on the notion of equality. You know, everyone gets one vote, no matter how much money you have. Well, we know the reality, but still, the theory is behind democracy is equality. And so, in our political system, and Thomas Jefferson, we talked about self-evident. Thomas Jefferson gives a technical philosophical argument in the Declaration of Independence. He says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're created equal. So democracy rejects an ocean of empirical evidence. Does everyone equally get into Caltech? Does everyone run just as fast in an Olympic race? Is everyone equal as an artist, as a mathematician? There is no equality. If you want to be empirical, democracy is absurd. It's absurd. It's totally anti-scientific. It denies all of science, democracy. But what's very interesting is that anyone that believes in equality is claiming that there is a metaphysical fact, which I won't use that word, it starts with the trumps. There's a metaphysical fact which actually refutes all the empirical evidence in the universe. And the metaphysical fact is we are equal. So if you want to explain away our deepest understanding, our deepest, most precious assumptions about the nature of life itself, you're going to need a whole lot of neurology and psychology and philosophy. You're going to have to write, 900 books to explain all that away. Whereas if you just say, why do I think that? Because it's true. Because reality is ultimately non-material. And ultimately, take idealism. Like Bishop Berkeley. It's very easy because we actually have no idea what things look like when we're not looking at them. Or, the quantum problem, spooky action at a distance. I mean, if quantum physics shows anything, it shows that we're kind of back to square one in terms of what the ultimate nature of reality is, that consciousness is causal. So the notion that materialism explains everything, that's like 19th century. Or at best, maybe 1920s or something. Even the ideological positivism, the Wienkreis, the Vienna Circle, the idea that you have to prove things empirically. Atheistic philosophy, I don't mean pious theologians, atheistic academic philosophy rejected that as absurd 80 years ago. So if you think it makes sense to push materialism in terms of academic, even atheistic philosophy, you're 80 years behind. You're like in the wrong century. And the reason philosophers reject it is because it's so ridiculously self-contradictory. If you say you have to prove things empirically, you cannot prove empirically that you have to prove things empirically. It contradicts itself. It's just it's just babbling, really. It's just your faith. If you say there's nothing real except matter, okay, it's a free country, but you just told us your religious belief. That's your religious belief. Because take math. If you say 2 and 2 is 4, or if you say, let's say 2 and 2 are not 5, in both cases, you're making a math claim. To affirm or deny a claim keeps you in the same realm of discourse. If you say x plus y equals z, that's algebra. If you say x plus y doesn't equal z, that's algebra. So if you deny the soul, if you deny God, you're preaching religion. It's just a negative religion. And it takes exactly, I mean, how do you know that? If there's no God, there's no omniscient being. If there's no omniscient being, no one knows if God exists. So if you say there's no soul, how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you prove that? You can't. It's absurd. The very question is absurd. So that's my point. When you say everything is physical, you are simply preaching your religion. You're not doing science. You're not even doing philosophy, actually. I mean, to be technical, you're just preaching. And so science has been contaminated by philosophical materialism. And there's a huge revolt going on. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of scientists, philosophers, they're revolting against it because it's absurd. Most of the greatest scientists in history, by the way, were religious. And then at a certain point, it shifted. But so that's someone's religion, that there's no soul. Everything's material. That's just a religious belief.
Professor Resnick?
Yes, please.
Could you suggest you're saying that a lot of people are going towards contemporary intellectual history is like denying philosophical materialism. Can you suggest some people to look at for that?
Yeah, actually, what is your name, by the way?
I'm Natalie.
Natalie. Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
Yeah, if you could send me an email, Pavan has my email, or I could just, actually, I'm going to try again to send a chat. I think I failed the first time. And then you could write me because I'm actually kind of helping to lead a Science and Philosophy Institute. And so there's some people I work with who really, they can give you a huge bibliography.
Sure. Okay.
So I'm going to, oh, there it is. Oh, actually, it's already there from AL. I'll do it again. So you'll see the email that comes in twice. I don't know if you can see it in your chats, the latest chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to hear from you. So please write me, and I'm more than happy to send you all that stuff.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Resnick, do you have time for one more question?
Oh yeah, I'm having a great time. I mean, I'm always afraid I'm boring all of you, but personally, I mean, for me, talking to intelligent younger people, it's yeah, I'm very happy. There's nothing I'd rather do.
All right, guys. So shoot away. We have time for one more question. And
well, this is America. You can't say shoot, because.
Okay. So we have time for one more question, and you're free to stick around after that too. But to see how the discussion goes. Any more questions for Dr. Resnick? I see John Pedersen over there. So John.
Hi there. I was just curious about, this is kind of like going to the first part of the talk. I was just curious if you could talk, or if you could say something about the idea that assuming that there are the morals behind everything, how do you know which ones are right? I guess in a sense, I don't know, or I shouldn't say that. Since we just made the argument that ethics, there are ultimate truths. How do we know which ones they are? I guess.
Well, no, that's good. What you said the first time was also good. Which ones are right, or the way you said it the second time. In a sense, and I think science can help a lot. Yes, I really said that. Because if you accept the general principle that to do good means to do what is beneficial. I'm going to give you an example of my own family. My mother, who was a wonderful mother, and I'm very grateful for the parents I had. I mean, they were wonderful parents, very loving. But anyway, so my mother used to tell this story. She grew up on a ranch in Riverside, California. She was brilliant, actually. She ended up with a high school education, ended up managing a pediatric wing of UCLA Medical Center. But anyway, very, very bright lady. And so she, when she had her first child, my older brother, I'm the second, He had a fever, which is very normal. And so she kind of panicked because her first kid had a fever. So she took him outside to cool him off. And so, which probably wasn't the best strategy, but so the idea is, if to act morally is to benefit yourself or others, to do what's really good for them, then science can tell us something about that. Like, for example, in my own service as a so-called spiritual leader, a lot of people come to me for counsel because, and so I try to keep up with certain science, let's say like psychology or even medicine, because I don't want to give people bad advice. And so I recommend all the time that people, go to a doctor, go to a mental health professional, or see what science says about this. And so there's a natural, how should I put it? There's a natural alliance. If you look at the Greco-Roman world, I'm going to give you like the 5-minute version of this, 3-minute version, okay, 2-minute version. I gave a whole talk on this at Stanford, actually, that if you look at the history of the relationship between science and religion, in the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, they were partners. It's like, okay, you take physics, we'll take metaphysics. And they understood that we're doing the same thing. We're trying to understand the universe, trying to understand reality, and we're focusing. It was kind of like, they saw it like geology and biology or physiology and space. And they were just, playing different positions on the same team. And that was like Aristotle. Aristotle kind of invented most of the branches of science, and he also did metaphysics. So, and it went on that way. And so what changed? You had the collapse of the Roman Empire, you had the Dark Ages, and suddenly Europe was ruled by these, what do you call them? Warlords. I mean, life was extremely dangerous, and you could just, there was no personal safety. You could be killed any moment. And so finally, the person that finally stepped in and started to restore order was Charlemagne. And you have what's called the Carolingian Renaissance, starting around, in the end of the 700s, early 800s. He invented the Western universities. He's a, you should like him on your social media. Anyway, so Charlemagne, because it was the Dark Ages and people are it was like everyone's trapped in this Monty Python movie. And so Charlemagne got the abbots and the different priests together, because they were the only ones that could read and write, and said, hey, why don't you guys open schools and like teach the people in your town to read and write? And so from that movement, you start to get places like the University of Paris, which becomes a Sorbonne, and then it keeps going. You get Oxford and Cambridge, and you get, anyway, I won't mention all the universities. So, but the way Charlemagne kind of restored order is he was really tough. One of the ways he was tough, was it a good idea? I can't say, but he did it. And that is imposing Christianity, which was a radical break from the classical Greco-Roman world, which had complete religious freedom and syncretism. I mean, Alexander, it's like, okay, we're worshiping the same God, we have different names, whatever. So classical religious syncretism and tolerance and freedom, first it descends into chaos, and the Europeans climb out of the chaos by imposing this fanatical religious doctrine. Everyone has to be a Christian, or we kill you. So what happened is, you start to come out of the Dark Ages, you come into the late Middle Ages, you get actually the Renaissance started in the Islamic world, because during those times, the Europeans were terrorists and and really violent, and the Islamic world was actually much more enlightened, and they're the ones who are doing the Renaissance. They're the ones that rediscovered the classical world. All the words we have that start with al, like alcohol, alkaline, those are all Arabic words. I mean, they were doing optics, they were doing, they were the optometrists back 1,000 years. Anyway, so finally the Renaissance comes to Europe, and they start to be rational again. You get Thomas Aquinas, who's sort of baptizing Aristotle. And then you get, anyway, the Renaissance starts. where this leads is that people start moving away from fanatical Christianity. And because Christianity is fanatical and it has political power, the Pope is like the supreme king, monarch in Europe. They have tremendous economic power. They own half of Germany, which is one of the reasons the Reformation caught on in Germany. Because if you were a German prince and decided, hey, I think Luther is right, you like suddenly became a millionaire. Anyway, so basically, to make it very short, you get this dialectic movement, as Hegel talks about in his philosophy of history. Hegel is just applying Newtonian mechanics to history, and saying that history moves dialectically. Every motion creates an equal and opposite motion, opposite. And so, so basically, fanatical religion creates its equal opposite, which is fanatical materialism. You get science, scientific revolution. Anyway, that's a sort of controversial term. Then you get applied science. Applied science is called the Industrial Revolution. And so not only is science giving the world all these wonders, medicine and transportation and just rational life, but between the Protestants and the Catholics, the religious people spent like almost 2 centuries slaughtering each other in the most horrible, cruel ways, as bad as you think it was with the Inquisitions and the religious wars. It was actually worse than you think. If you study the history, it's actually worse than you think. And so on the one hand, you have this like compare and contrast. Religion, which has given us, the church universities wouldn't let go of Ptolemaic astronomy. They wouldn't even accept Copernicus. So it was crazy. So the church represented kind of this obscurantism and violence and fanaticism. Then you have science, which is light, which is freedom, which is reasonable, which is curing diseases, which is discovering the real nature of the universe. So obviously, science takes over the universities eventually. And they see religion as the enemy. So you get this, what historians call the war thesis or the battle thesis, where science sees religion as the enemy of human progress, the enemy of human knowledge. So for example, you get Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, who says that the priests of the world are like snakes, they're like the poisonous snakes. And they're poisonous snakes, and science is like Hercules, when the Greek myth was born and crushed the poisonous snakes that were surrounding him. And so you get Marx. You get Marx, who says that religion is just this drug that makes people stupid and completely insensitive to their own suffering. You get Freud, who says that religion is a psychological disease. So you get this concerted attack. Religion is the enemy. We can only progress by attacking religion. But what happens is, there's Natalie.
If I make this point though, it's just going to completely just like T-bone in the sense of like the postmodern idea though, it's like, for example, if you made the point that referring back to science in itself can be helpful in order to understand the correct rules in order to how we should govern
absolutely
ourselves. So if we're looking at Freud, though, who was a major proponent of psychology, and then you look at other individuals who basically were just like, very anti-religion. At the same time, I feel like because of that shift away from religion,
right,
they allowed for other philosophies to kind of come into play. That kind of it made a circle. It came back again.
Right. Very good point. So I was just about to wrap up what I was saying, but it actually fits perfectly with what you said.
Cool.
Did you finish that? Did I interrupt you?
Yeah, that was my point. Yeah.
Okay. But thank you, because that was a great intro to what I'm about to say.
Nice. Perfect.
And that is that what happened is, go back to Newtonian, laws of motion. So what happened is the pendulum was pulled all the way to one side, which was fanatical religion. Then the church, of course, jumped onto Cartesian astronomy and science, and then that got surpassed, but they kept clinging to the yesterday's science. But anyway, so because the secularists, and of course in the French Revolution and the French intellectual revolution, the 18th century, they were like viciously anti-religious. And so in terms of the universities, the secularists, the materialists won, and religion was domesticated. I mean, for example, America, two of the greatest universities in America, which are the University of Pennsylvania, the Ivy League school, and then University of Virginia, they were both founded. I mean, Penn was founded by Benjamin Franklin, Virginia, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, and both of them said that our universities are going to teach Christianity over my dead body. Because, and so the idea is that America, I mean, first England, of course, England was way ahead of France in that, because, if you look at France, France had fanatical religion and fanatical absolutist monarchy, and therefore they had fanatical anti-religionism. England, because it was much more moderate, you had a Newton, someone could be religious and at the same time a great scientist. And so France was more radical in England, although as materialism started to win, also in England, they kind of jumped on the bandwagon. But what happens is when religion is domesticated and kind of muzzled, so it's not this mad dog that's biting everyone, if I may use that sort of unflattering image of religion, but when religion is domesticated and controlled, it no longer is no longer powering a pendulum swing to the other direction. Because when you don't pull the pendulum, let's say, very far to one side, it doesn't go very far to the other side. And so therefore you have whole new generations of scientists, of philosophers, all kinds of scholars saying, why is it that we hate religion? Why is it that we are philosophical materialists? When that obviously doesn't explain the experience of being alive and being conscious. And so that's kind of, what we were talking about, and I'm going to send you all those links and everything. That's what's powering the revolt against materialism. It's actually just the dialectic moving. It's because when religion is no longer threatening science, more and more scientists don't understand why we have this sort of viciously anti-spiritual posture, which has nothing to do with science. In fact, if you want to know why Copernicus, how he discovered the solar system is heliocentric, it was because of religion. It was because of religion. It was because Copernicus was a student of Plato. Augustine was a student of Plato. And Plato talks about, this great metaphor of the sun, the source of light, and therefore the source of knowledge, because light, of course, means knowledge symbolically throughout world literature. So he thought, if the sun is so great, as Plato explains, and if the sun in Plato represents God, maybe the sun should be the center of our world and not the earth. Because actually the earth is a place of fallen souls, whereas the sun represents God symbolically. So hey, let's try the math in a heliocentric world, and hey, it works. Another very religious person who said that it was just all God giving him this knowledge was Kepler, the great astronomer Kepler. And Newton said the only rational way to explain the laws of nature, which I am putting forth, is it must be God. And so the idea that somehow God interferes with science, that was true at a certain point, but even that, for example, Galileo, scientists will never stop telling us that Galileo was put on trial. They love to tell that story. The real history, though, if you study it, what they don't tell you is that Galileo was put on trial, not because he believed in a heliocentric world, but because he was unbelievably obnoxious. And actually, long before Galileo, Copernicus already made the point. And the Pope at the time, I forget his name, but you can study the history. The Pope at the time, he's the one that kind of said, get rid of Galileo. He's put under house arrest. He liked Galileo. He was interested in science. He was not against the heliocentric idea. In fact, he wrote a book about it. He was like trying to figure out these things. He actually befriended Galileo. He was enthusiastic about all this Renaissance stuff. And so Galileo reads his book and then writes a public review basically saying, Galileo writes a book, which they often did in those days, dialogue, because Plato had dialogues, in which there's some guy who's just kind of like a moron, and that's the Pope. So he publishes a book saying the Pope's a moron. And then he goes on trial, but what you hear from the scientists is, no, it's, the church trying to kill science. There's a lot more going on. Most of it is just politics. In fact, what powered the scientific revolution, that's not me. Someone put out your incense. It's your smoke detector. Anyway, just kidding. So what really powered the scientific revolution was a religious idea. Because let me go back to the Stoics from the Greco-Roman period. There was these intellectual people called the Stoics. And they had this great idea. It's really, they were actually right. And that is that ultimately, if there's a God, God is a rational being, not jealous, not wrathful, not torturing people forever, not just, acting like a psychopath. But God is actually a perfectly rational being. And therefore, in creating the world, the creation itself is rational. It's law-abiding. It's a rational universe. And the word they had for this rationality was logos. The word was logos, from which we get logic and all the, ology, physiology, geology, all the ologies are just the Greek logos. And it comes from this ancient tradition. And so the idea is that because God created your body, the logos is in you. You have the power of reason within you. And so your power of reason, of logic, connects to the logos, the logic of the universe, of the physical world. And by connecting, you do science. Because we can imagine a universe which was not lawful, in which the laws of nature are not regular. Everything happens a different way, a different time. You drop a ball, sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes sideways, and there's absolutely no way to predict it. So we take for granted that the universe is lawful, law-abiding, but the earlier generations, they weren't as dull as we are. And they didn't take it for granted. And so their enthusiasm, their confidence that we can figure out this universe is because it's lawful. And because there is a benevolent, in the literal Latin sense, benevolent, Spanish, bien, or, bien voluntad, buena voluntad. Benevolent means wishing the good, because God, being a perfectly rational being, wants us to be intelligent, to be rational. And it was a common saying during the Renaissance and during the scientific revolution that God didn't just give us one book, the Bible. He gave us two books. The second book is the book of nature. And so there was this enthusiasm, but it was respectful. And it led to all kinds of scientific discoveries. So the idea that God consciousness and science somehow oppose each other is absurd. It's an absurd assumption. And it completely misunderstands the history of the scientific revolution. And it's actually a little, there's some, should I do these questions that are coming in on, I don't know how you guys feel, but people are watching around the world. And so if you start getting a lot of spam and commercial email, I'm just kidding.
Professor, so I have a question if you have time for one more.
Yeah, please. I'm having a great, I really believe that you guys are the future hope of the world.
Dr. Resnick, there was another question by Deepan. So I guess
who's the lady that just spoke?
That's Leica.
Lisa, please. Yeah, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's both more like a question as well as a point. So I was actually thinking, for example, we as humans we have consciousness for ourselves, but we are also extremely conditioned by the laws of this universe. For example, like if I put my hand on a flame, I do expect it to heat. But maybe in a different universe, the laws are very different and different things can happen. So I feel like we are already limited by our own bias and perception. And like, so for a really long time, I actually like kept thinking about, okay, if there is a higher intelligence, then someone should have created that higher intelligence, and then someone should have created that higher intelligence, and there's no real no real what's the source. But then I later started realizing that I'm already limited. Like if you drop me at a very different location in a very different culture, very different language, I don't know how much I'll survive, because that is like a completely new environment to me. So I'm, as a human with a consciousness, I'm already limited in by so many factors. So like, should I even like try to understand everything about this higher intelligence, or should I have a starting point? Like I should just try a few things. I should try and understand as much as I can, and then I'm like, okay, this philosophy makes sense, and then I try to like progress, and maybe eventually things will start making sense.
That's a very interesting question. That was really good. I mean, I admire your sincerity in just trying to understand what life is all about. I think that's really admirable.
Thank you.
A few things come as far as the infinite regress, like who made this and who made that before. Aristotle, on logical grounds. Aristotle, by the way, is father of modern Western logic. And Aristotle, on logical grounds, not on religious grounds, because he wasn't like a super religious guy. But Aristotle said, the way he put it, which is almost Newtonian language, there must be an unmoved mover. He says, because an infinite regress is a non-explanation. So an unmoved mover. But then, if I could just throw something in, I don't know if it's really exactly on what you were saying. Okay, well, actually, I'm sorry, what was your name, Lalita?
Leka.
Leka. Oh, Leka.
Yeah.
Okay, let me give you a philosophical argument against an infinite regress of causes.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the argument from contingency. And contingency here means like dependence, like causal dependence. Like, for example, your existing within a material body is contingent upon your having parents who begot you.
Mm-hmm.
So your physical form is not, it doesn't exist autonomously. It depended on your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so the point is that if we look around the material world, everything we observe is contingent. In other words, nothing exists autonomously. Whether it's a building, whether it's your body, whether it's, you take the Big Bang idea, whatever version you like. But the point is that the universe exists the way it is now because something else happened before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because the essence of science, you could say many things with the essence, but the essence, let's say, of rational analysis or scientific analysis is to try to understand causality. This causes that causes the other thing, and so on. So if everything in the universe, to the best of our knowledge, is contingent upon something else for its existence in the way that it now exists, the obvious question arises, why does anything exist? Or how could anything exist? Because we can imagine that nothing ever existed. I mean, it's not promising, but I mean, imagine if it were the case, just as a thought experiment, what if it were the case that nothing ever existed? And why wouldn't that be the case? Because everything depends on something else. How could that be? And so Aristotle concluded, as a logician, not as a priest, Aristotle concluded that there must be, and he used sort of this, almost the language of physics. He said there must be an unmoved mover. There must be an unmoved mover. Now, some scientists say, I thought I'd throw this in, some materialistic, well, I should say materialists, they're not saying this as scientists, they're saying it as materialists, philosophical materialists, that science shows that you can't have divine intervention. That if we want to explain why things happen, like why does it rain, or how do you get living organisms and all that, that you know, you can't talk about divine intervention, you can't talk about miracles, you can't talk about stuff like that, because science has shown that that you don't need that, and you can explain everything without that. And if you do bring it in, it kind of spoils the game. It kind of ruins science. And so I'd like to address that, which is ultimately bad philosophy. Most people who are scientists never took a philosophy course in their life, and it really shows. I mean, as much as if I tried to explain to you all about biology or physics, I mean, and I went past my 11-word vocabulary in those areas, then if I really tried to take on more complicated issues, I'd make a fool of myself. And they very much make fools of themselves when they try to do philosophy. And the biggest fool of all, I have to say, is probably that Dawkins. I mean, if you are a trained philosopher, an academically trained philosopher, historian, he's like unbelievably clownish, because philosophically, he says things that are absurd all the time. He just doesn't know he's saying them, because he doesn't even know enough philosophy to know he's being absurd. But anyway, so take the point of science. First of all, science gives us what science tells us. Let's say physics. Oh, there's something I wanted to tell Natalia. If I could just mention it real quick, and I forgot to say it in response to what she was saying. And that is, what happened with science is where science defeated religion, and, you know, religion's the enemy and science is king of the hill, and we rule, you know, no one comes to objectivity except by us, that, you know, we are the way, the truth, and the light. It's an amazing mere reflection of fanatical Christianity. But anyway, so then what happened is, because if you accept this basic model that things evolve, if you accept evolution as an all-pervading, a ubiquitous, universal, explanatory principle, not just for explaining where you get humans, how do you get, because after they did that with Darwin, okay, where do you get the first life? Then how does the universe evolve? So evolution becomes the universal explanatory principle. A necessary result of that was that physics became exalted above the other, and sort of using biblical language here, that among all the sciences, you know, physics shall be exalted, because physics deals with the simplest things. Because when you deal with chemistry, you've already got chemical stuff. But in physics, it's the simplest. So therefore, in a world, in an analytic universe in which evolution is God, then physics is queen of the sciences, so to speak. And that's what happened. Physics was exalted. Now, it was precisely in the science, branch of science, exalted above other sciences, that they just drove their car 130 miles an hour into a brick wall, which was the wave particle debacle. And so what's interesting about this wave particle nightmare, which happened, you see, because before that happened, science had a principle which was called correspondence. Correspondence means that when a Newton or an Einstein or a Kepler or a Copernicus or a Galileo, whoever, when they give us scientific principles and formulas and equations, they're describing the real world. So when Newton talks about, let's say, inertia and planets flying through space, but then their trajectory is curved by the laws of gravity, that's what's really happening. That's what's really out there. And even Einstein, when he talks about space-time, that's what's really there. If you had kind of like a God's eye view, you would see that's really what's out there. But when you get to quantum mechanics, suddenly, Jesus, you know, suddenly we don't know what's out there. Because every time we look at it, kind of cross dresses or something. You know, it's like we don't really know what's out there. And so therefore they had this Copenhagen Agreement in the 1920s, where all the top quantum physicists in the world got together, and they actually said, and you have to admire their honesty. I mean, I have to give them credit for their intellectual honesty. They said that we are giving up the principle of correspondence. In other words, we can no longer promise you that what we describe is what's really there. If you could really see what's there, it may not correspond to what we're saying. All we know is we make great digital stuff. Because if you think of electron and electronics, the applied quantum mechanics was fantastically successful. It gave us the digital world. So the applied science is fantastic. It's just that we don't know what's really there. And so when they gave up this principle of correspondence, and then, but meanwhile, what's happening is, if you want to know where we stand now and why we're in a post-truth age historically, I'll explain the whole thing to you in just a minute. Because at the same time that physics is running out of gas and just crashing into this wave particle mess, meanwhile, the philosophers who are being just like, science is running circles around them, because science just keeps getting better and better and better, more and more applied science. And back in the philosophy barn, it's like, we've been doing this for 2,500 years and we don't know what the hell we're talking about because we can't agree on anything. And so you have this contrast where science is the way, the truth, and the light. Philosophy is just blah, blah, blah for 2,500 years. So therefore, philosophers trying to save themselves, they say, we need to be like science. In fact, we need to be servants of science. Because it used to be theology, for centuries, theology was the queen of the sciences, theological science, and physical science was just the handmaiden of theology. In other words, like Newton, you do science in order to verify great theological insights, like that there's a rational God that rules the universe. So science is the handmaiden of theology for centuries, up to and including Newton. But then the world changes and now philosophy is the handmaiden of science. So they're just going, they want to be like science. You know, we're making asses out of ourselves. Let's be like science. So they have this group of very influential philosophers. They meet in Vienna in the 1920s, and they say that any philosophical claim which cannot be verified by scientists is meaningless. So if you talk about a soul, it's meaningless language. It's just babbling. You're not saying anything. If you talk about God, if you talk about objective morality, it's just babbling because empirical science can't prove it, and therefore it's meaningless. Anything material, and the philosophers do this. They kind of emasculate themselves, so to speak. But meanwhile, no sooner do they start genuflecting to physics than physics says, whoops. You know, they run into this quantum problem. And then meanwhile, when all this filters down to the world, what we find is quantum physics, which is like the bedrock science, he just had a flat tire in terms of their ability to describe the universe. And meanwhile, science, which is following physics, if physics is kind of a little confused, who needs philosophy? And therefore, anyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's opinion. And what we really need to throw out here is the whole notion of objectivity. And this fits in perfectly with growing narcissism, which is the inevitable consequence of a consumer society, because everyone is trying to sell you something. And the way they sell you something is by flattering you. So you have consumerism galloping forward, and meanwhile you have this sudden new relativism where objectivity is under attack. And so therefore, people decide, let us democratize reality. Let us democratize reality. There are no objective truths except one. There are no objective truths. That's the only
Is
objective
that all
truth.
postmodernism, or is that just absurdism?
That is good question. It's so nice to talk to intelligent people. So that is philosophical postmodernism. You have, for example, postmodernism and literary criticism, but they're related because if you think about people who anyway, won't mention their names, but literary criticism kind of goes crazy and you get deconstructionism. In other words, a book has no objective meaning. It's just whatever meaning you find in it. Even the author may think that she or he, I say she because my favorite author is Jane Austen, but anyway, so even the author may think that this is what my book is about, but no, there is no objective meaning even to your book.
But what about the difference between when you have a theoretical idea, but then there's also the praxis that goes along with that theory? I mean, the execution of it usually has different results than like, okay, let's just talk about this, and then we have like some circular reasoning that doesn't really get us anywhere.
Could you give an example? Could you do an example of that?
I mean, it would only be coming from my own personal like interest in like, so different like art movements during like World War II, like the Dadaist movement or different things like that, using that as a framework to kind of understand that like a lot of the stuff that's the political issues that we're having right now in the United States, that there is sort of like a frontier where people can say, okay, the mainstream is not the only containment for ideas. So looking at like the theories that were brought out of postmodernism, for me, yielded results in the fact that I was like questioning what was going on, and then I started to look elsewhere other than like the mainstream.
Okay, good. That's a great example. So I'm going to jump in there.
Go for it.
Thank you. So, okay, I will argue that, as you can see, I'm argumentative. I will argue that what you said is important. It's historically important. It's important in various ways, but it may not capture the essence of postmodernism, and I'll explain why, although it's very important in itself, whatever we call it. When I went to school, I was in Berkeley. I was in Berkeley in the late 60s. I was out there in the street. I even had my picture taken with my older brother it was on the front page of the Oakland Tribune in the middle of some riot, political riot. There's all the stuff going on back then. So I was kind of in the middle of it. And so we were definitely anti-authority. I mean, we didn't believe what the government said was like, seriously, you're going to believe that? The government said, what our teachers said, and our parents, of course, I mean, obviously our parents, we love them, but they have no idea what's going on. Because, our parents think we should be in Vietnam. So it's like our parents, God bless them, I love them, but they have no clue. And so we definitely rejected all the traditional authorities. But the difference was, I think, and maybe it's not, maybe the kind of postmodernism you experienced is not so different, so please correct me. But we assumed, most of us, that what we heard from government, parents, teachers is not it, but there is a truth, capital T, and we have to find it. We didn't doubt for a second. We were not relativists. We didn't doubt for a second. There is an absolute truth. There is a highest truth, and that's what we should be searching for. It wasn't relativistic. My understanding of postmodernism, certainly this is true in philosophy. It may be different in the wing of it you experienced. But I mean, it's, and I know it's true in some forms of postmodern literary criticism. Yale University has this really nice program where they film some of their classes and you can watch them online. And I was trying to watch this course. Nice guy. He's a nice guy, the teacher. I was trying to watch it, but every time I tried different classes. I kept thinking, that's crazy, and I turned it off. But So he was talking about this postmodernism. I listened to his lecture on postmodernism. He was saying that there is no objective meaning, but it doesn't mean to become what's the word? What's the word I'm thinking of? A complete relativist. To reject it. It doesn't mean to become completely moral relativist. Let's say. You can still believe that there's no objective meaning, but you should take care of your kids, or you should, be nice to other people, or take care of animals and everything. And at that point, I shut it off because I thought that's terrible philosophy. Because sure, you can tell yourself a story. You can say that, okay, I don't believe there really are objective moral principles, but I can see how if I follow that, the world would be terrible. So it's in my self-interest in terms of the kind of world I just want to believe in, or not believe in, the kind of world I want to live in, that I'm going to go ahead and sign the social contract.
I think that's called sociopathic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so the idea that you can have your cake and eat it too, or you can, how do they say that in Portuguese? They have a funny way of saying that. I forgot. I'm thinking of something else. But the idea that you can have complete relativism and at the same time all the benefits of objective morality, like people actually believe that you do have to take care of your children, you have to take care of your elderly parents, you do have to be kind to people in general, you have to be kind to animals, and that these are actually objective, binding principles. And so that if I don't believe, you see, the problem with, I was speaking to, I think it was Max, was that the name?
It was a Max, yeah.
But the point I was discussing with Max is that if I say that, I mean, really, if you say, Callicles has this very discussion with Socrates, by the way, in a Platonic dialogue. If you say that it's really not wrong, let's say, to rape someone, that's not actually wrong, or it's not wrong to go and shoot up, go into someone's house and kill the family. It's not really wrong. It's just that we tell ourselves that because if I kill other people, they may want to kill me. And so therefore it's kind of in my interest. And so the reason I pretend that it's wrong to kill other people, it's not really wrong, but the reason I pretend it's wrong is because I think it's in my own selfish interest. But of course, the problem with that is that there are a lot of people who, if you promote this idea, it's not really wrong, they'll say, hey, I'll take my chances. You may, and this is what Callicles says to Socrates, you may tell me that if I do all kinds of malicious things or just act with just totally amoral selfishness, that other people may do it to me, so it's in my interest not to do it. Hey, I'm a gambling man. I'll take my chances. I think, to use the word they'd always use in Greek, dialogues, I want to be a tyrant. And so I think that I can seize power, I can enslave other people, and I can get away with it. And so if I believe I can get away with it, and it's not morally wrong, then I'm going to do it. And so you may think that by all this sort of, fancy Dan talking, that you're going to get everyone to sign the social contract. But guess what? You won't. And if we study historically, what we find is, as a historical fact, put philosophy as a historical fact, sustainable moral systems come from religion. Someone may not like that. They may wish the world wasn't like that, but that's the way it is. That's the planet you got yourself born on. And sustainable, I don't know of any in history. I don't know. And when I say sustainable, I don't mean like some crazy person takes power for 10 years like Hitler or something. I mean, sustainable, that it turns out you can keep it going for centuries. I'm not aware of any sustainable moral system that did not come from religion. And there were many attempts by communists, for example. They wanted atheistic morality. And there are philosophers. There are philosophers who are atheists and think that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to live in a world where people rape my daughter and that's okay. or people, you know, kill me or kill my friends. I don't want to live in that kind of world. And yet I'm an atheist. So therefore I have to come up with a powerful moral system that is sort of like logically or rationally binding, so that if you're a reasonable person, you will have to accept it, and yet it doesn't require anything metaphysical. And I think that's been an incredible flop.
So then going back to the point that you made about correspondence, it's like if you're basically making the argument, it's not necessary for it to kind of come around that way.
I'm sorry, could you say it again? I apologize.
Sure. Going back to the point that you made about correspondence, that
Yes.
it's basically just like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That it's not necessary for, you know, you have a branch. It's not necessarily for that branch to have existed to have branched to where we are now for that concept to have developed from
Yes.
the original premise.
So that form of relativistic postmodernism, the first point is it's totally self-contradictory. In other words, it's nonsense, because they're saying it's an objective fact that there are no objective facts.
So then going back though to what I think his name was Josh, what he had asked about like studying rules, and then Leica had also made a point about how much do we have to study the rules? How deep in depth do we have to go to live a more, I don't want to say peaceful, but more of an intelligent way of dealing with the universe, or approaching a more lawful way of doing that.
I think that people, I mean, I you know, I never thought I'd do this, but I'm going to sort of refer here to Hobbes, the English philosopher Hobbes. It's very interesting. You know, he was born, there's an interesting story. As he said later, he was born in terror, because he was born in 1588 and the Spanish Armada had just sailed up onto the English coast. This was the most dangerous, horrible, frightening military fleet ever assembled probably in human history. And his mother lived on the coast. And she was pregnant with him. She just looked out her window one day, and the Spanish were Spain was not part of the Renaissance. They were still medieval. If you look at how the Spanish behaved in, you know, the New World, in Mexico and Peru and other places, they were pretty medieval. And so she was so terrified by the Spanish, and it was terrifying, that her child came out, which happens sometimes. A woman is sort of near giving birth and she's like shocked or terrified, her child can come out. And so Hobbes was born in terror. And he had this philosophy that people left to their own devices. This is like anti-romanticism. Romanticism is that, you know, we are by nature good and virtuous and kind. Government, just get off our back, leave us alone, and we'll be nice to each other. And Hobbes is the opposite. Hobbes says, no, people are brutish, people are cruel, and therefore you need a heavy government, even a dictatorship. Because even a cruel dictatorship is better than the atrocities that will happen if you don't have a heavy government. That's Hobbes. Of course, John Locke is the one that kind of refuted him. But anyway, so in regard to your question, I mean, I think Hobbes, I'm not in favor of cruel dictatorships by any means. I mean, I like freedom. However, it is true that people left to their own devices some people, maybe not most, but enough people will do very bad things. We're seeing that in America today. In terms of people who, let's say, have certain political preferences in which they are totally oblivious to the truth. Someone could be lying to them hourly, on an hourly basis, lying to them, and they think it's the truth. And so, and when you have democracy, anyway, I won't get into the whole thing. It's dangerous. I'm not anti-democracy, but it's dangerous. Because because there are different forms of democracy, and one of them is mob rule, the vigilante mob. Because I've seen that. I mean, I've traveled a lot in third world countries. I've lived in many third world countries, and America has serious problems, but I've seen places that are on the outside democracy, but it's just like, sort of like total corruption. And the point is, I mean, Hitler was elected. Hitler is one of the fruits of democracy. A democratic government killed Socrates. So the idea that, you know, just, it's a dangerous world, and we have to think very carefully. So I would advocate that not just making people religious, because religious people can be the most cruel, evil people in the world under certain conditions. I mean, religious fanatics are right now today, you know, causing most of the, you know, murders of innocent people on earth right now are caused by religious fanatics. So, but I think spirituality, not just, you know, religious fanaticism, where people actually understand, you know, get in touch with themselves as spiritual beings. If you don't base the morals, for example, even Christianity, with all it's like going all day about the problems in their history, but they did sort of abolish slavery. Because for all their cultural sophistication, which was very advanced, of the Greco-Roman people, they loved slavery. They said one of the reasons, for example, you know, Athens had sort of like direct democracy, not a republic. Every free citizen would go up to the Acropolis, which means the high city. If you've been to Athens, you know, all the free citizens would go up to the Acropolis and they would literally vote. They had real democracy. But the reason they could do that is because maybe up to half of the people who lived in Athens were slaves. And so the free citizens had lots of time for committee meetings and voting. And so, I mean, even Jefferson gave that argument in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're created equal. So we're not equal. Anyway, I won't go into all the philosophy of it, but there, Enrique. Oh, my sincere apology. Enrique, ¿dónde estás?
Yeah. Actually, I just.
I'm sorry to keep you waiting, but.
Oh, no problem. I'm actually Andres. I'm just under Enrique's account.
Andres. Okay.
Yeah. So I was just gonna, since we were on the topic of moral relativity, I just wanted to clarify that the point I was making, what I said earlier, I wasn't trying to make a case for moral relativity. Rather, what I was trying to say is that that rather than taking the statement that killing is wrong as an axiom, I think it is more sound to say that to complete that's sort of like to say that it is a theorem, and that's a theorem that's derived, that the theorem is that if we want to have a, say for example, a peaceful society, then killing is wrong, and that is from my perspective more easily considered to be objective.
Okay, but I'll tell you the problems with that. First of all, although I accept what you said, Andres, I want to get your name right. Although I accept what you said, that that morals in this world, you know, they tend to be situational. For example, let's say if I was, say, at home with my family and someone came to harm them, I mean, to really harm them, and my only option was to shoot the person. I'm not a great shot. You say, okay, shoot him in some non-lethal, you know, I just got to shoot the guy to stop him. And he's, you know, he's gonna kill my family. I mean, I couldn't pull the trigger fast enough, and I would feel great about it. I have a disciple, a student of mine, who's this wonderful lady. I like her very much. I mean, anyway, if she's listening, I don't want to embarrass her. You don't know her, so she won't be embarrassed. Raisha, she works for the Los Angeles Police Department. And she's actually like a professor at the police academy. But before she did that, she was out on patrol. And so she responded with her partner to a domestic violence call. And she went in there, and there was some guy who was kind of crazy, who was sort of, you know, abusing his wife. And so when they came in there, he pulled a knife and went after her. And she just very calmly plugged him. And she didn't kill him, but she shot him, and because he was trying to kill her. And I was really happy that she shot him. And so, I mean, I'm not happy that that person was so demented that he has to suffer like that. I wish he could have been a good person. But I mean, to say you shouldn't kill, that's situational. To save innocent lives, if there's no other way to stop someone from taking innocent lives, then I think it's morally justified. But then the other thing you said was what was it, Andres? Then you followed. There was the second point. What was it?
Yeah. Actually, what you said, I think makes my point that it is problematic to take as an axiom that killing is wrong precisely because of these situations, and so then it is logically more sound to then to say that it is a theorem that if we want to have a peaceful society.
Oh, I remember. Yeah. Okay, let me add it. Okay, first of all, I would say that, thank you for these questions, good questions. Philosophically, I would say that, let's say, thou shalt not kill is a sub-principle. It's not the most basic principle. I would say a more basic principle is that you should pursue the good. You should do what's beneficial. And I think you can't avoid, like you sprinkling in a little utilitarianism here. Utilitarianism, which is do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, is not something which is, there are limits to that. I mean, that's relative to other situations, but still, it is part of the mix. And so, if you accept as a more general principle, pursue, the greatest good for everyone. In fact, it's even, if you accept the law of karma, it's even better to stop someone. If someone's about to kill a lot of innocent people and you're forced to kill that person because you have no other option, it's actually even better for that person. You've actually done what's better for everyone. So as far as the theorem, you said it's a theorem which, no, because, I would say moral philosophy does contain theorems, but it's not based on theorems. It's just like, for example, let's say you have a scientific principle. Well, I'm sorry, Andres, do you want to respond before I go on?
No, actually, I totally agree with you. I agree with the statement that general, excuse me, that general good, or I don't remember how you said it, but it's a more fundamental principle than not killing, because if we take that as an axiom rather than not killing as an axiom, then one can deduce what is right to do in different situations, and so then I believe then I would consider general good as a more fundamental principle than not killing, precisely because of the points you made.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So if I can just read real quickly, this is Deepan Kishore Kumar, unless it's someone using Deepan's account.
Resnick, could you hear me?
Yes.
So my question.
Is that Deepan?
Yes, it's Deepan.
Okay, thank you.
It's more circling back to the idea of...
Deepan, just a second. Quick question. Dr. Resnick, I was hoping if we could end by 9 o'clock, because, usually we kind of give food, like we serve out food in our programs, but right now we're leaving people a lot of food for thought. And so I was hoping if we could end this by 9, it will be kind of...
okay. Or maybe we can do that.
In fact, like you could forward me material, which I could, in fact, mail it to all of them.
Yes.
Material which for example, I guess you were speaking to Natalie about certain material regarding bibliographies you were talking about. We'll be happy to mail it to all of them, but like I was just requesting if for like,
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. But yeah, go ahead, Deepan. Thank you.
So my question is coming back to the idea of through yoga, if you realize that the conscious soul is different from the body, and then there's no death really, and it's just the body that dies. How do you reconcile that with, say, the sufferings that other people are experiencing, like maybe right now, right? Even if you feel as a self-realized soul, you see thousands of people dying right now around the world. Does that mean that you're not supposed to feel bad for their death, and you just accept that that's the natural cycle? And
Good question. If I could, maybe if I could just get an extra few minutes, I'll stop around 9, but just because there's this story, because this story is too good not to tell. When I was at Berkeley, when I first went to Berkeley, I took a sociology class. Sociology departments back then were like the staging grounds for Marxism. In fact, some universities, because they couldn't fire tenured professors, they actually abolished their sociology professors just to get rid of these radical departments. But anyway, so I had a teacher in sociology, this young guy from New York, who's one of the main leaders of the Berkeley Revolution. I mean, during that whole thing, he was like one of the main people. And he took me under his wing. I had him in a sociology class, and he kind of identified with me. We had a similar background, and I was like he really liked me. And he was a Marxist, like anyway, that's another topic, Marxism. So then what happened is I did something which he thought was disgusting and horrible and hypocritical and the worst possible thing I could have done. And it wasn't that I, murdered my parents. It was that I joined the Hare Krishna movement. And so I was out on the street. This is 1969. I was 20 years old, and I was out on the street, selling these little magazines and everything. And so he came by one day with his girlfriend. And of course, he was a Marxist. So religion is the enemy, anything spiritual. And this wasn't even, this was a religion. Anyway, so when he saw me as a monk, he went crazy. I mean, literally, I thought he was going to have a stroke right there on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. He was so angry and agitated that I had become religious, or as he thought. Actually, I wasn't. I just wanted to be spiritual. I wasn't actually that interested in religion. But anyway, he became so disturbed that I remember when he talked, he was like spitting. Someone's like so angry they can't control themselves. Remember, he told me, I will never trust anybody again. I will never believe in anybody, because I was like his pet thing. Anyway, I forgot, what was your original? I apologize, I just had to tell a story, but it's connected to your question. But just really briefly, what did you say again? I apologize.
Yeah, so the question is, if you realize that your soul is...
Okay, I remember. Sorry, I don't interrupt you, but I remember. Yeah, because the argument that the communists gave, the Marxists, was exactly what you just kind of put forward as a possible argument. And that is that if you believe in karma, as people in Asia do, Hindus, Buddhists, and all that, if you accept karma, then you won't feel compassion for people because that's their karma. Why should I care? Which is absurd. I'll tell you why it's absurd. Let's say you're a medical doctor. I just realized with this camera, I keep sticking my hand in your face, so sorry about that. Anyway, let's say you're a medical doctor and a patient comes to you who has a disease entirely caused by their own lifestyle choices. Like, let's say the person smoked and therefore has lung cancer, as opposed to diseases where, a person basically had a normal life. It could be, genetic or whatever. But this person really caused their own disease by lifestyle choices. As a doctor, am I not going to feel compassion for that person? What you care about, if you're a good soul, is that people are suffering and you want to stop their suffering. The fact that someone caused their own suffering.
That's if you're a doctor, it's your karma to care for your patients, regardless of what brought that suffering.
No, I'm not speaking but I'm giving examples.
From a perspective where when I'm detached from someone in another continent dying,
but we're not detached. We're not detached. The point is, first of all, we have psychological limits. Neurological limits. You can't get emotionally involved with 10 billion people or 8 billion people. You would basically, like in the first hour or two, you would have to be taken to a psychiatric closed facility. The point is, it's just neurologically impossible to get emotionally involved with large numbers of people. And so therefore, we talk about caring. What I'm doing is I'm comparing, let's say someone who rejects karma and someone who accepts it. The neurological limits are the same for both of them, you could say. Your nervous system can only take so much stress. You can only take so much really entering into the suffering of another person. So my point is the extent to which it's just neurologically possible to care about other creatures. You would care that nothing, let me put it this way, nothing about the belief in karma would reduce your compassion. How much you care about people depends on how much you care about people, what kind of person you are. But your compassion, your empathy, and your sympathy in no way are reduced by your understanding of karma. In fact, it's the opposite. Because what happens is, after World War I and then World War II, you get these waves of absurd theater of the absurd. You get philosophy of the absurd, people like Sartre, sort of this atheistic existentialism. We live in an absurd universe, there's no meaning. Because when you see large amounts of human suffering and you think it's not karma, and you think we just live in this insane universe, the universe doesn't care about us, it doesn't respond, we have no power, that's when you start to get nihilism and hedonism. Because if you're a nihilist, you think nothing is real, you become a hedonist because you're not a yogi. And so if nothing matters, then why not go out in glory, enjoying yourself as a hedonist? And so when you believe in karma, it gives you actually a rational way to stop people suffering, or at least to stop their future suffering, because there is causality. There is causality. And when you master the causality, that's when you can get control and make things better. Because, what is biomedical research? It's mastering the causality of disease. So karma not only doesn't make you compassionate, it inspires compassion, because there's a way to rationally address human suffering and the suffering of other creatures. Whereas if you don't believe in karma, you must believe that there's just a crazy world we live in where there's no good reason for people suffering. So why bother? Why try to fix the world when the world is so irrational? And that is the conclusion, by the way, that the nihilists came to. So your compassion increases when you understand karma, actually, rationally. Last point, just, I forgot another thing I was going to tell Natalia. Sorry, I just forgot all these points that, oh my God, I just forgot it again. Oh, that was, and this for all of you, not just Natalia, but everyone, that what science tells you, there's nothing in science that tells you that God can't intervene in your life or in the world. What science tells you is that within a closed causal system, these causes will produce those effects. In a closed causal, in other words, if there's not someone else like with their finger on the scale, or someone pushing the ball, it's just rolling naturally. So in a closed causal system, where you have a complete catalog of the causes and you understand the relevant laws of nature, you can predict what will happen. But there's no branch of science which proves, because it logically can never prove, that the world is a closed causal system. All you can say is within a closed causal system, this will happen. In fact, we know that the world is not a closed causal system. We know that for a fact, by the simple fact that we have free will. That's why sociology, psychology, all the human sciences never became and never will become hard sciences, because you can only have a hard science of dead things. You can't have a hard science of beings with free will. And so therefore, because we do have free will, the universe is not a closed causal system. Even if you don't believe there's a God who intervenes, we intervene. Because let's say a rock can be rolling down a hill, you can put out your boot, you can stop it. And so therefore, if someone at the top of the hill was saying, I can tell you exactly when this stone will hit the bottom of the hill, but you intervene because you have free will. What if someone's trying to show, the speed at which things fall by the law of gravity, and so they go up, let's say, into the 20th floor of a building and drop a ball, but what if someone on the 11th floor sticks out a net? And so, and you can't predict that because the person didn't tell you they were going to do it. And so actually we can prove that we do not live in a physically closed causal system because we have free will. And so the question about divine intervention doesn't give us a new system. It's just the question among the conscious beings with free will who often intervene in physical events, is one of them God. In fact, NPR just had this show I just heard today, where because of all the silence from the quarantine, that animals, it's affecting animal behavior, because animals communicate a lot. Birds through sound, they signal each other constantly. And what's happened is that so much human noise has interrupted and distorted animal communication, which changes their breeding habits. Frogs, for example, left alone, when they croak, they all croak together. It makes a much louder sound, and it scares off predators, where if they each croak individually, it doesn't scare off predators. So what happened is, because of human noise pollution, it throws off this unisonic frog croaking, and therefore they're getting eaten more. They're more vulnerable to their predators because they can't get in sync because of human noise pollution. So with our free will, we are constantly intervening in the laws of physics. And so the question is there a bigger guy that does that? We already know that it's not a closed causal system. Anyway, thank you all very much. It's
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry for interrupting, but yes. I have a kind of burning question. I just would like to ask that, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. So you mentioned that. There is free will. So therefore, we basically we are not in a closed causal system. And I would like to just say, like, so I work closely with neuroscientists, where we basically try to correlate brain activity in different regions and try to study how we respond to different stimuli. So, and now you mentioned in your talk that, and we also know from scriptures that, like, the soul is the seat of consciousness, and the brain is just acting like some sort of a medium. So now, is there any point in actually trying to do the science that we're actually doing? Like, for instance, trying to study how this random neural activity that we observe in different parts of the brain actually correspond to stimuli, but because there might probably be so many different factors that we don't have any control over.
Yes.
So,
I think, well, I'm all in favor of science, but science which is real science. What I oppose is not science, it's science which it's philosophical materialism parading itself as science. I'll give you one example. Let's say you're doing those experiments, and what they show is to try to prove determinism, like we have no free will. I'm a brain scientist, you know, I didn't choose to be one. I was driven by the laws of nature, which is kind of absurd. Because what you find is that in different situations, people tend to make choices or do certain things because of their neurology. However, that's a fake argument. I'll explain why. Because what we know is, unless, you know, some neurologist misled me, that not only do brain states influence behavior, but behavior changes brain states. That's why activities can be habit forming. And when they get too habit forming, they become addictive. And so actually the relationship between behavior and brain states is interactive. And so therefore, if people in the past tended to behave a certain way because they chose to behave that way, that creates a neurological predisposition to continue behaving that way. So therefore, when you're doing the brain science and showing, okay, we can show that people are conditioned to behave in certain ways, but they have created their own conditioning. It's like, for example, let's say someone makes the tragic decision to take heroin. And as we know, that can lead to a radical loss of free will. And so you could say the person is taking heroin because of their neurology, but they created that neurology. And so, you know, when two things are interactive, if you assign total causality to one half of an interaction, you've got bad science happening. And that's just an example of how scientists, instead of acting, some of them, there's a lot of really good scientists, you know, I'm not anti-science, but the crusader scientists who are materialist crusaders, their philosophy skews their science because they make assumptions which are based not on an objective reading of data, but based on what they want to be true because that's their worldview, because that's their religion. And so as far as the value of doing it, I'm all in favor of brain science because I think a lot of people could be helped, a lot of people could be cured, a lot of people. So, I mean, to me, science, not philosophical materialism, not all that, which is actually terrible philosophy. But anyway, but just science. I love it. I mean, I think you can't have too much science unless it's weapons science in the hands of, you know, bad people. But in terms of medical science, I mean, the more we can relieve human suffering, the better. I mean, in a sense, you know, I don't know, bionic research now, it's like the new Jesus in the sense, you know, the blind can see and the lame can walk. And so, yeah, so real science, especially, I mean, I'm all in favor of anything that relieves human suffering and allows people to have a better life.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's you're a great group. I mean, actually, I had a similar thing I did years ago at MIT. And yeah, so yeah, you're a great group. I mean, very intelligent and open and articulate. And so it's really a very sincere pleasure for me to be able to meet you and talk to you. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Resnick, and I hope that, you know, we get to, you know, see you again. And thank all the people who, you know, who stuck to the end. You know, it's kind of amazing to see this turnout. I never expected that, and it was very good. And for sure, we'll be coming back with more. And hopefully, when the pandemic is kind of lets loose a little, we might even have physical programs wherein, you know, we could interact better. And in fact, we might just leave you with actual food than just food for thought.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Natalia and Akshay, yeah, please do write me and I'll be very happy. There's one devotee, his name is Ramananda. He's actually British. That's his, you know, he's initiated spiritually, but he has a PhD in biology.
Okay.
And he's a great guy, really a great guy. Everyone loves him. And so he is really kind of like the librarian. He's assembled this very formidable list of books in this area.
I see.
I could put him in touch with you.
For sure. Like, please send me any material, or anyone has any questions, forward them to us. We could forward them to Dr. Resnick, or he can give it to us and we send it out to you guys. And we will stay in touch. We might reach out to you for any feedback or like future programs, but thanks again, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're a great group of people, and it was really a pleasure to be able to do this with you.